2 months after Ethan proposed, I gave him my grandmother's sapphire ring, an heirloom passed down through generations and entrusted to the man joining the Bennett family. The velvet box lay open on the coffee table between us. My grandmother's sapphire and diamond ring rested cold in my palm, its platinum worn smooth by generations of weddings, ordinary Sundays, and a lifetime of family memories. Ethan looked at it as though I had placed something embarrassing in front of him. "I deserve a real diamond, Natalie," he said, "not your grandmother's old stone." My name is Natalie Bennett. I was 28 that night, and until then, I believed I understood the man I was going to marry. I was an architect who specialized in restoring historic buildings. I spent my days preserving things built to outlast the people who created them, so I'd always believed true value came from craftsmanship, history, and the stories people left behind. My father's watch never left my wrist. Much of my furniture came from estate sales I'd restored myself, and I never saw the point of replacing something simply because it was newer. Ethan couldn't have been more different. At 26, he was a senior buyer for a luxury menswear boutique. He could identify designer labels from across a room and cared as much about prestige as I cared about permanence. Somehow those differences drew us together. We met while my firm redesigned his company's flagship store. During our first site visit, he corrected a contractor's pronunciation of an Italian designer before turning to me. "You're the architect? You sound disappointed." "I expected someone older." "I expected someone less judgmental." He laughed, and for a long time I mistook that easy smile for depth. He introduced me to rooftop parties, fashion launches, and restaurants where the menus never listed prices. I took him to antique markets, historic neighborhoods, and forgotten buildings waiting to be restored. We admired different things, but back then I thought that was part of why we worked. Now, standing across from me, his confidence finally slipped. "Where are you going?" "Home." He frowned. "That's it? I tell you I don't want your grandmother's old ring, and you just walk away." I studied the man I'd spent years imagining as my husband, and for the first time I saw him without the excuses I'd always made for him. What I'd once called ambition, pressure, or refined taste was simply selfishness wrapped in expensive clothes. "You're right," I said quietly. "It is an antique. It carries a lifetime of history, and I thought that would mean something to you." "It does." I shook my head. "No. What matters to you is the price tag, the name on the box, and what strangers think when they see it." "That's not fair. I thought this ring welcomed you into my family's future." I slipped it back into the velvet box and met his eyes. Instead, it showed me the future I would have had. I turned toward the door. He didn't move until my hand reached the handle. "You'll calm down tomorrow," he said, sounding irritated rather than concerned. That was the moment everything became clear. Ethan still believed this was an argument he could win, that I'd come back apologizing and ask what size diamond would finally satisfy him. "Natalie," he called as I opened the door, "don't do something stupid over a ring." I looked back one last time. It was never just the ring. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The velvet box felt heavier in my coat pocket than it had an hour earlier, not because our future had fallen apart, but because I didn't yet realize the heirloom I'd carried into Ethan's apartment had also led me out of the wrong future. He was right about one thing. By the next morning, I had calmed down. What he never understood was that calm wasn't forgiveness. It was clarity. I barely slept. Before sunrise, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the untouched velvet box hanging inside my coat pocket, torn between opening it to prove the night had really happened and wishing I could erase Ethan's voice telling me I'd come to my senses. My phone buzzed. 11 messages waited for me. The first few sounded almost concerned. "Did you get home safely? Call me when you wake up. We need to talk like adults." Then the tone shifted. "I can't believe you walked out over one honest conversation. You put me in an impossible position." I wasn't rejecting you. I was rejecting a ring that doesn't fit my life. By the final message, he'd rewritten the entire evening. "You knew what kind of world I work in. Giving me that ring and expecting me to pretend it was enough was emotionally manipulative." I read that sentence 3 times. Somehow, after cooking his favorite dinner, offering him the most meaningful heirloom my family owned, and welcoming him into my family's future, I had become the villain in his version of events. I started typing a reply, wanting to remind him exactly what he'd said about my grandmother's ring, then deleted every word. Nothing I wrote would matter to someone who had already decided his version was the truth. Around noon, he called. I let it ring. More messages followed. "This silent treatment is childish. If you loved me, you would want me to wear something that made me feel proud." That one stayed with me. For years, Ethan had claimed he admired the way I found beauty in old buildings, restored furniture, and overlooked things. Now he was accusing me of not loving him, because I'd offered him something rich with history instead of something flashy enough to impress strangers. By evening, his messages had grown colder. "I think we both need space. You clearly don't understand the pressure I'm under. Maybe we want different lives." I turned my phone face down and buried myself in work. Days disappeared into drawings, client meetings, and site inspections while Ethan kept texting, each message sounding exactly like the last. Another excuse, another justification, another attempt to make me responsible for what he'd done. Not once did he ask whether I was okay. 4 days later, one final message appeared. I'm willing to move past this if you are. I watched the screen go dark. Move past this. As though the only thing standing between us was my refusal to replace the ring quickly enough. I never answered. About a week later, the calls finally stopped. The silence should have felt like relief, yet it only left me wondering how our relationship had unraveled long before I'd realized it. 2 weeks after our engagement ended, I was scrolling through my phone when Ethan appeared. On my screen, beneath the golden entrance of a rooftop restaurant, smiling beside Olivia Hayes. During the final months of our relationship, she'd slowly become a constant presence in his stories. First an old college friend, then a successful investment consultant who understood wealthy clients, and eventually the woman he claimed helped him choose clothes because, according to him, I never appreciated how much presentation mattered. Whenever I questioned how much time they spent together, he smiled as though I were imagining problems. Olivia understands that world, he'd say. It's easier to ask her than explain everything to you. Now her hand rested comfortably against his chest, a massive, colorless diamond flashing on her finger beneath the restaurant lights. The caption read, "When you finally get what you deserve. #RealLove. #RealDiamond. #upgraded." My stomach tightened. Even before checking the date, I knew exactly what I would find. 14 days. Only 2 weeks had passed since he'd pushed my grandmother's ring back across the table. I opened Olivia's profile. There were photos from a charity dinner the month before, a private fashion event 6 weeks earlier, and one of them laughing together at a luxury hotel bar on the same weekend Ethan had supposedly been away at a buyer's conference. The timeline left no room for denial. Olivia hadn't entered his life after our relationship ended. She'd already been part of it. The ring hadn't destroyed our future. It had simply forced Ethan to stop pretending he still wanted one with me. I sat in the fading afternoon light, replaying everything I'd missed. I imagined him telling Olivia about my grandmother's ring, laughing at how cheap it looked, then turning me into the punchline whenever he told the story to someone else. That thought embarrassed me for a while, but only until something finally clicked. Every comment he'd made about my clothes, my car, and even my father's watch had been teaching me to measure myself against his world instead of my own. As those thoughts settled, I began seeing everything differently. Ethan's comments about my clothes, my car, even my father's watch had never been harmless observations. Little by little, he'd trained me to measure myself against the people in his world until feeling inadequate became normal. My phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend. "I'm sorry, Natalie. I didn't know they were going public tonight." Going public. Those 3 words told me everything. This wasn't a surprise. People had known. I replied with one question. "How long?" A few minutes later, the answer came back. "I don't know exactly. People have been talking for a while." I set my phone aside. I expected anger. Instead, what settled over me was something quieter. Curiosity. My eyes drifted toward the drawer where I'd placed the velvet box. Ethan had dismissed the ring as old and embarrassing, replacing it with a diamond so oversized it looked more like a status symbol than a promise. For the first time, I stopped wondering what the ring meant. I wanted to know what it was worth in Ethan's language. The following afternoon, I took it to Everhart and Sons, an auction house tucked inside a limestone building in the historic district. Warm light reflected off antique watches and jewelry displayed beneath glass as a receptionist escorted me into a private appraisal room. An elderly man rose from behind a mahogany desk. "Mr. Sterling," the receptionist said, "this is Natalie Bennett." His polite smile disappeared the moment I opened the velvet box. "May I?" I nodded. He lifted the ring with practiced care and examined it beneath an appraisal lamp through a jeweler's loupe. The room fell silent except for the slow ticking of a grandfather clock as he studied the sapphire, the hand-cut diamonds, and the platinum filigree before finally looking up. "Do you know where your family acquired this?" "My grandfather bought it before he proposed to my grandmother in 1958. As far as we know, it was already an antique." "Oh, much older." He lowered the loupe again. "This is an authentic Art Deco piece, likely made around 1925. The sapphire appears to be untreated Burmese cornflower blue, extraordinarily rare, and these are original old European-cut diamonds. Modern stones may be more precise, but they can't reproduce this kind of character." He placed the ring gently onto a square of black velvet. "The craftsmanship alone is exceptional. Very few jewelers today could recreate this filigree without charging a fortune." Only 2 weeks earlier, Ethan had dismissed it as a costume piece. When Mr. Sterling asked about its history, I told him about my grandparents and the 62 years they spent building a life together. He listened quietly before folding his hands. "That's what collectors value," he said. "Not just gemstones, but the history attached to them. Provenance gives a piece a life beyond its materials." Then he gave me his estimate. "If this went to auction today, I'd expect somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. I stared at him. "For the ring?" He smiled. "For the ring." My eyes returned to the sapphire beneath the lamp. Ethan had barely looked at it. Here, it was being treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for museum pieces. "With the right collector," Mr. Sterling added, "it could bring even more." I thought I'd feel vindicated. Instead, I felt unexpectedly sad. The appraisal hadn't made the ring more valuable. It had only shown me how little Ethan had understood what he'd been holding. When Mr. Sterling asked whether I wanted to consign it, I closed the velvet box. Not yet. That afternoon, I placed it in a safety deposit box at my bank. As the drawer disappeared into the vault, I realized the ring no longer represented my failure. It reminded me that another person's inability to recognize value could never diminish it. I never called Ethan. I never shared the appraisal or corrected whatever version of our breakup he was telling. I let him believe he'd rejected something ordinary. The ring stayed locked away for 3 years. By then, heartbreak had become memory instead of identity. The anniversaries that once hurt had turned into quiet reminders of how far I'd come, while my small architectural practice had grown into Bennett Stone Atelier, a studio known for restoring historic homes without erasing the stories written into them. Clients didn't come because we followed trends. They came because we believed history deserved to be preserved. Every time someone said that, I thought of my grandmother. One rainy afternoon, while explaining why I wanted to preserve the original staircase in a century-old townhouse, the homeowner asked, "Why not replace it?" I ran my hand along the worn oak railing. Because every scratch proves someone lived here. Once you erase every imperfection, you erase part of the story. His wife smiled. "We'll keep it." As they left, my assistant Lauren bumped my shoulder. "You know you stopped talking about stairs halfway through." I laughed. "Did I?" "You were talking about yourself." Maybe she was right. Healing came the same way restoration always did. Slowly, one careful piece at a time. I bought a small apartment overlooking the river, adopted an aging golden retriever named Oliver, and gradually stopped checking Ethan's social media. Somewhere along the way, silence stopped feeling lonely and started feeling like peace. That October, Lauren dragged me to an architectural preservation exhibition at the City Museum. "If you spend one more weekend alone with blueprints," she teased as we hurried inside, "I'm staging an intervention." I talk to people every day. Clients don't count. The museum buzzed with quiet conversation as I wandered toward an exhibit on Art Deco interiors. A voice beside me broke the silence. "Beautiful, isn't it?" A man about my age stood studying an original bronze door handle beneath glass. He wore a navy sweater instead of an expensive suit, and nothing about him suggested he cared what anyone thought. "I'm Daniel." "Natalie." He nodded toward the display. "Everyone else is looking at the ballroom, and you're looking at the door handle." He smiled. "It survived. Thousands of people touched it long before we existed. I like wondering where they were going." I smiled too. It wasn't the answer I expected, but it was a far better one. Most people admired appearances. Daniel noticed history. We ended up talking for nearly 40 minutes. He was a museum historian specializing in architectural conservation, and before long, we drifted from stained glass and forgotten train stations to handwritten letters and why people are always too quick to throw away things they'll one day wish they'd kept. When he asked if I'd like coffee sometime, I said yes before I could overthink it. Being with Daniel felt nothing like being with Ethan. Our dates revolved around bookstores, museums, farmers markets, and long walks through neighborhoods neither of us had explored before. He never cared what I wore or whether a restaurant looked impressive, and somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting to be judged. He never rushed me either. Whenever conversations wandered toward family and I grew quiet, he simply let the silence exist until I was ready to fill it. Little by little, I realized trust grows best when it isn't forced. Nearly 8 months later, a Saturday storm kept us inside my apartment. Oliver slept beside the window, while Daniel wandered past my overflowing bookshelves before stopping at an old photograph near the fireplace. My grandparents smiled back from the frame, the sapphire ring catching the light on my grandmother's hand. "They look happy." They were. 60 years? 62. He studied the photograph for another moment before saying quietly, "I'd love to hear about them someday." He wasn't asking about the ring or even their marriage. He wanted to know about them. Something inside me finally loosened. I made tea, and we settled onto the floor while rain tapped softly against the windows. For the first time since Ethan rejected my family's heirloom, I told someone everything. From the candlelit dinner and the velvet box to Olivia, the Instagram post, Mr. Sterling's appraisal, and the safety deposit box where the ring had remained ever since. He listened without interrupting, letting the silence settle before speaking. "You know what hurts the most? I always thought it was the rejection. I don't." His eyes returned to my grandparents' photograph. "You offered him a place in your family's history." I frowned. "He thought you were only giving him a ring," he said softly. "What you were really offering was trust, the chance to become part of the family that taught you what love looked like. He was too busy chasing a brand name to recognize what you were placing in his hands." I looked down at my tea. Mr. Sterling admired its craftsmanship. Collectors admired its rarity. Daniel was the first person to understand what it actually meant. I hadn't only lost a fiancé. I'd lost the future I believed we were building together. He reached across the space between us and quietly took my hand. He didn't defend Ethan or criticize him. He simply stayed with me, and somehow that quiet presence said more than any speech could have. After a while, he asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Why is the ring still locked away? I glanced toward the rain sliding down the windows. I honestly don't know anymore. I think you do. His eyes drifted back to the photograph. It still belongs to your grandmother's story. I nodded. So why sell it? I'm not talking about the money. He paused. I'm talking about what it's doing to you. That ring already did its job. The night Ethan rejected it, it protected you by revealing who he really was before you married him. The words settled quietly between us. But every time you think about it now, he continued, you think about Ethan instead of your grandmother. My chest tightened. I do. And that's the part that isn't fair. To who? To her. I lowered my eyes as Oliver wandered over and rested his head against my knee. She shouldn't have to share her memory with someone who never deserved either of you. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Rain traced slow lines across the windows until I finally whispered, "What if selling it feels like letting her go?" He smiled gently and squeezed my hand. I don't think memories live inside jewelry. He glanced toward the photograph. I think they live inside the people who carry them. Several weeks later, I returned to Everhart and Sons. Mr. Sterling looked up from his desk and smiled as soon as he saw the familiar velvet box. Miss Bennet, it's been a while. It has. He opened the box with the same care I'd remembered 3 years earlier, the sapphire catching the light as he looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Are you certain? This time I didn't hesitate. Yes. He closed the lid, nodded once, and smiled. I know exactly which auction it belongs in. Mr. Sterling explained that the ring would be featured in the upcoming Important Jewels Autumn Auction, where collectors from around the world would compete for exceptional pieces. For the first time since the night Ethan rejected it, I realized the ring was no longer carrying the weight of my past. It wasn't simply being sold, it was beginning a new chapter. It would be professionally photographed, carefully documented, and presented to people who valued history as much as craftsmanship instead of chasing whatever happened to be fashionable that season. As he finished the paperwork, he smiled. I hope whoever buys it understands what they are receiving. So do I. Neither of us realized someone already would. The evening of the auction arrived sooner than I expected. Daniel and I settled into our seats while bidders quietly filled the gallery. I had barely opened the auction catalog when a familiar laugh drifted across the room. Every muscle in my body tightened. I hadn't heard that laugh in 3 years. Several rows ahead sat Ethan Parker beside Olivia Hayes. Before I could even focus on his face, the oversized lab-grown diamond on Olivia's finger caught the chandelier light. Of all the places I'd imagined seeing Ethan again, this wasn't one of them. Yet there he was, completely unaware that the old stone he'd rejected was about to become the centerpiece of the evening. The room fell into the respectful silence unique to auction houses. Beneath crystal chandeliers, seasoned collectors quietly studied their catalogs, while centuries of jewelry and craftsmanship waited behind glass. Daniel squeezed my hand. Nervous? A little. You don't have to prove anything tonight. I smiled. I know. You already did that 3 years ago. The knot in my chest eased. Just before the auction began, Mr. Sterling stopped by our seats. The ring photographs beautifully, he said. We've already had strong interest from several international collectors. Is that a good sign? It means your grandmother's ring has reached people who understand what it is. After he walked away, I opened the catalog. Lot 119. My grandmother's sapphire filled an entire page. Under professional lighting, every detail stood out. The delicate platinum filigree, the rich cornflower blue sapphire, and the warm fire unique to old European-cut diamonds. Beneath the photographs was a single line. Provenance, passed through 3 generations of one family and associated with a marriage lasting more than 6 decades. I traced the edge of the page. She would have liked this. Daniel glanced at the photograph. I think she already does. Before I could answer, I heard Ethan laugh again. 3 years had changed him. His clothes were still immaculate, but the effortless confidence I'd once admired had given way to the restless composure of someone constantly performing for the people around him. Beside him, Olivia's diamond flashed every time she turned a page in the catalog. Daniel followed my gaze. You know them? My past. He asked nothing else, quietly slipping his hand over mine beneath the catalog. The auction began. One remarkable piece after another found a new owner while my attention kept drifting toward row 4. Ethan barely watched the bidding, checking his phone as Olivia commented on different lots. Even from a distance, they looked polished rather than comfortable, more like business partners than 2 people sharing an evening together. Nearly an hour later, Mr. Sterling stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, our next offering is one of tonight's highlights. My heartbeat quickened. The lights dimmed, and a massive image of my grandmother's ring filled the screen behind him. For the first time, I saw it the way everyone else did. Not as the heirloom I'd grown up with, but as an extraordinary work of craftsmanship. Lot 119, the auctioneer announced. An exceptional Art Deco sapphire and diamond ring, circa 1925. Close-up images appeared across the surrounding screens as he continued describing the untreated Burmese sapphire, the old European-cut diamonds, and the handcrafted platinum filigree. 3 years earlier, Ethan had looked at this ring and seen only what it lacked. Tonight, an entire room saw exactly what my grandmother always had. When the auctioneer spoke about its documented provenance and the 60-year marriage connected to it, my throat tightened. Beside me, Daniel leaned closer. Now everyone knows what you were really offering. I swallowed without answering. Across the room, Ethan had gone completely still. His eyes remained fixed on the enlarged image of the sapphire before instinctively dropping to the oversized diamond on Olivia's hand, as though he couldn't reconcile the two. "What is it?" Olivia whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $30,000, and paddles rose almost immediately from every corner of the room. 35, 40, 50, 60. The bidding accelerated so quickly that excitement rippled through the gallery. One offer barely settled before another followed, confirming what Ethan had failed to understand 3 years earlier. The ring's value had never been defined by the size of its stone, but by the craftsmanship, history, and love it carried. Ethan leaned toward Olivia and whispered something. She frowned, glanced from the stage back to him, then continued watching as the bidding climbed into the 70s. Slowly, understanding spread across her face. She'd clearly heard the story before, just not the version unfolding in front of her. Near the stage, Mr. Sterling caught my eye for the briefest moment and smiled. He'd been right. Collectors understood exactly what this ring was. A telephone bidder pushed the price to $80,000. The room fell silent. 80,000 once? The auctioneer scanned the room. 80,000 twice. For one strange moment, I wondered whether Ethan might raise his paddle, not because he finally understood the ring, but because he'd finally learned what it was worth. Sold! The gavel cracked through the ballroom, followed by polite applause. I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was over. My grandmother's ring had finally found someone who recognized its value without needing me to explain it. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think so." Across the room, Ethan hadn't moved. Olivia stared at him, her confidence giving way to suspicion. "Ethan..." He stayed silent. "The ring..." His expression told her everything before he spoke. "You never told me." "I didn't know." "You knew enough." "I swear, I didn't know it was worth 80,000. I closed my eyes for a moment. Even now, after everything, his first instinct was still to talk about its price. Not the family, not the love behind it, just the number. 3 years had changed nothing. Olivia lowered the catalog into her lap. "So that's the woman you told me gave you some cheap family heirloom?" Several guests nearby glanced over before politely pretending not to listen. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't the place." Olivia let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "No, I think it's exactly the place." She looked across the room at me, then back at him. "You lied. It wasn't like that. You made her sound pathetic." You said she embarrassed you." The color drained from his face. Then Olivia noticed Daniel sitting beside me, with his hand resting calmly over mine. She watched us for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. It wasn't only that Ethan had lied about me, he'd lied about the kind of man he was. Without another word, she stepped aside, leaving a clear path between Ethan and my row. He walked over slowly and stopped beside my seat. "Natalie." "Hello, Ethan." His eyes followed the attendants carrying my grandmother's ring off stage before returning to me. "That was your grandmother's ring." It was. He stood there searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, I realized he still hadn't changed nearly as much as I'd hoped. "Why didn't you tell me it was worth $80,000? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the applause faded into quiet conversation as guests stood and staff prepared the next lot, but all I could hear was the question he'd asked. After 3 years of rebuilding my life, the first thing he still wanted to understand was the price. I studied him carefully. His suit was as immaculate as ever, but the certainty I'd once associated with him had disappeared, replaced by something far less comfortable. I saw regret, not because he'd lost the ring, but because he was finally beginning to understand what he'd thrown away. "I did tell you," I said quietly. He frowned. "No, you never mentioned the money." "Because I wasn't offering you money." He said nothing. "I told you it belonged to my grandmother. I told you she'd worn it through 62 years of marriage and that it represented the life she and my grandfather built together." I held his gaze. "I thought that was its value." He lowered his eyes. "I know that now." "Do you?" He looked back at me. "I do." I glanced toward the stage where the next lot was already being prepared. "No," I said gently. "You know its price now. That's not the same thing." His shoulders slumped. "Natalie, you still haven't answered the question I asked 3 years ago." He blinked. "What question?" "What mattered more? The life that ring represented, or what strangers would think when they saw it on your hand?" His mouth opened, but no answer came. Beside me, Daniel remained silent, never interrupting or trying to rescue me. His quiet presence left Ethan alone with the truth. Finally, he exhaled. "I was wrong." "You were." I've replayed that night 1,000 times. "So have I." I was under so much pressure, my career, my clients, the expectations. I shook my head. "You've already told me all of that." He rubbed a hand across his face and let out a tired laugh. "It sounds pathetic now." It sounded pathetic then. A faint, embarrassed smile crossed his face before his eyes drifted toward Olivia, who still stood a few feet away watching us. There was no anger left in Olivia's expression, only disappointment. "Ethan," she said quietly, "tell me the truth." I am. No. Her voice never rose. The truth about Natalie. Silence hung between them before she turned to me. When Ethan told me about your relationship, he said you gave him some cheap family heirloom and expected him to wear it without caring how it affected his career. Daniel's jaw tightened. Olivia shook her head. He never told me it belonged to your grandmother, and he certainly never mentioned it was one of the most extraordinary antique rings I'd ever seen. I didn't think he would, I said. Ethan let out a weary breath. I wasn't trying to lie. Olivia met his eyes. What would you call it? He hesitated. I simplified things. You erased everything that made her understandable. You turned yourself into the victim. He had no answer. A quiet, disbelieving laugh escaped her. That explains so much. What does? The way you tell every story. She held his gaze. Anyone who disagrees with you somehow ends up sounding unreasonable. His shoulders slumped. Then she asked a question none of us expected. You've been seeing a therapist, haven't you? His head lifted. How did you know? She offered a sad smile. Because someone who repeats the same mistake for 3 years usually isn't changing. After a long pause, he nodded. I started therapy almost a year ago. Even I hadn't expected that. He looked down before speaking again. For a long time, I convinced myself it was never about the ring. Then my therapist asked why I remembered the auction estimate more clearly than I remembered what Natalie said before she handed me her grandmother's heirloom. He swallowed. I couldn't answer. His voice grew quieter. Then she asked what hurt more, losing $80,000 or losing someone who trusted me enough to place her family's history in my hands. He finally looked at me. That's when I realized I never lost the ring. His voice cracked. I lost you. For a moment, the ballroom faded away. 3 years earlier, I'd imagined hearing those words 100 different ways. Back then, they would have broken me. Now they only made me sad. I wish you'd understood that sooner. So do I. His eyes shifted toward Daniel. I guess you found someone better, Daniel answered calmly. I don't think that's how love works. Ethan looked at him. I'm not better than you. I just valued the things Natalie had been offering all along. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. Olivia slowly removed the oversized diamond from her finger, turning it beneath the chandelier light. For a long time, she said quietly, I thought this ring meant I'd won. She smiled without humor before sliding it back on. Tonight it feels very small. Ethan looked at me again. I'm sorry, I know it doesn't change anything. It doesn't. I hurt you. You did. I embarrassed your family. You did. I turned something priceless into a status symbol. You did. There was no anger left in my voice, only acceptance. He nodded after each answer without trying to defend himself. If I could go back, I shook my head. No, I'd change everything. I don't think you would. He frowned. You don't want your old life back, I said softly. You want to be the person who would have made a different choice. He held my gaze before giving the smallest nod. Those aren't the same thing. No, he admitted quietly. They're not. For a moment, we both looked toward the empty pedestal where my grandmother's ring had rested only minutes earlier. My grandmother used to say people eventually reveal what they worship. A faint smile touched my lips. Some worship appearances. Then I looked at Daniel. Others protect the things that can't be measured. Silence settled over us. Ethan's eyes drifted to the oversized diamond on Olivia's hand. 3 years earlier, he'd admired that sparkle with pride. Tonight it looked strangely lifeless. I followed his gaze. Can I ask you one last question? He nodded. Do you finally see the beauty in my grandmother's ring? I let the question hang for a moment. Or do you still only see $80,000? The color drained from his face. His lips parted, but nothing came out. Any answer would condemn him. If he spoke about beauty, he'd admit he'd rejected it without ever seeing it. If he spoke about money, he'd prove he still hadn't learned a thing. His silence answered for him. Olivia watched him for another moment before quietly turning away. I'll wait outside. She wasn't leaving me. She was leaving the story she'd believed for the last 3 years. Ethan remained where he was as the ballroom slowly emptied around him. Finally, Ethan looked at me. I hope you're happy, Natalie. The words caught me off guard, not because he said them, but because I knew he meant them. I glanced at Daniel, whose hand still rested lightly around mine before meeting Ethan's eyes again. I am. I wasn't trying to convince him anymore. Or myself. It was simply the truth. I watched him disappear through the ballroom doors without feeling triumphant. Regret arriving years too late had never been the ending I'd wanted. All I felt was relief that he no longer had the power to decide what I was worth. Daniel waited until the doors closed behind him. How do you feel? My eyes drifted to the empty display where my grandmother's sapphire had rested only minutes earlier. For years, that ring reminded me of the worst night of my life, I said quietly. Now it reminds me of 2 people who loved each other for 62 years. A smile found its way onto my face. It finally feels like I'm remembering my grandmother again. I looked at the empty pedestal one last time, and instead of remembering Ethan, Daniel smiled and gently tightened his hand around mine as we left the ballroom together. Outside, Olivia stood alone beneath the museum lights, absent-mindedly turning the oversized diamond on her finger as though she were seeing it for the first time. Daniel and I slipped out through a side entrance into the cool autumn night. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the streets polished with reflections of the city lights. For a while, we walked without speaking. The silence between us no longer carried unfinished conversations. It felt complete. We eventually reached the little Italian restaurant we'd been returning to for years, where we'd celebrated birthdays, promotions, And the day I'd won a preservation contract neither of us expected. We'd even shared a slice of tiramisu there once, because we were too full to order dessert separately. The owner smiled as we walked in. The usual table? Daniel looked at me. What do you think? The usual table. We settled into our corner by the window, while candlelight flickered across the wooden table. The waiter knew us well enough to bring Daniel a glass of wine and me a pot of tea without asking. When we were finally alone, Daniel asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. I thought tonight would feel like revenge. But it didn't. I shook my head. It felt like finishing a chapter. He smiled. Most endings are quieter than people expect. I laughed softly. For years, I thought I needed Ethan to understand what he'd thrown away. And now, I realized I don't. Even saying the words surprised me. For so long, I'd imagined him discovering the truth about my grandmother's ring and finally understanding how deeply he'd hurt me. Instead, I stood in that ballroom and realized the healing had already happened. His regret had simply arrived too late to be part of it. Daniel reached across the table and laced his fingers through mine. "I'm proud of you." "What for?" "You never turned the ring into a way to prove him wrong." I smiled. "I wanted to." "I'm sure you did. But that would have meant letting him decide what it represented." He squeezed my hand. "And you finally stopped?" "I did." We walked home beneath slow-moving clouds, where Oliver greeted us with enough enthusiasm to nearly knock Daniel off balance. "I think somebody missed us." "I think somebody missed you." Oliver happily followed Daniel into the kitchen while I lingered in the living room. My grandparents' photograph still stood beside the bookshelf, exactly where it had always been. For years, seeing my grandmother's smile had brought back that night with Ethan before anything else. Not anymore. Now I remembered crowded Sunday dinners, the sound of her laughter filling the house, and the way she insisted every meal deserved fresh flowers, even if she'd picked them herself that morning. Those memories belonged to her again. 6 weeks later, the proceeds from the auction arrived. Even after taxes and commissions, the transfer was larger than I'd ever imagined. I stared at the confirmation for a long moment before quietly closing my laptop. For 3 generations, that ring had carried one family's story. Now it would help begin another. I used part of the money to buy an aging warehouse near the river. Most people saw a leaking roof and broken windows. I saw possibility. 6 months later, Bennett Stone Studio opened its doors. Unlike my architectural practice, the new space focused on handcrafted furniture, historic restoration, and custom interiors built from reclaimed materials. Every restored table, door, and window frame displayed a small card explaining its history alongside photographs of the building it had once belonged to. One afternoon, an older gentleman walked into the studio carrying a business card from Everhart and Sons. "I attended the auction," he said. I welcomed him inside, and without another word, he wandered through the showroom until he stopped beside a walnut dining table, running his fingertips across the grain. "This reminds me of the sapphire ring." I smiled. "Really?" He rested his hand on the polished wood. "It carries the same feeling." "What feeling?" "Soul." He commissioned the table that afternoon. Word spread quietly after that. Clients who had heard about the auction found their way to the studio, not because of the price my grandmother's ring had brought, but because they believed I cared as much about preserving history as I did about craftsmanship. About 7 months later, Lauren walked into my office balancing 2 coffees and wearing the expression that always meant gossip. "I heard something." I looked up from my blueprints. "Should I be worried?" "Probably not." She handed me a cup. "Ethan and Olivia called off the engagement." I waited. She tilted her head. "That's it? What were you expecting?" "A celebration." I smiled. "I hope they both find what they're looking for." Lauren studied me for a moment before laughing. "You actually mean that?" "I do." After she left, I realized I'd spent less than a minute thinking about Ethan. There had been a time when news about him would have stayed with me for days. Now it barely interrupted my morning. That's when I realized healing often announces itself quietly. Daniel and I kept building our life in small, ordinary ways. We restored an antique writing desk from an estate sale, planted herbs across my balcony, and spent rainy evenings cooking while Oliver slept nearby. Somewhere along the way, I realized love isn't built from grand declarations. It grows through ordinary days that 2 people keep choosing together. For Daniel's birthday, I disappeared into the workshop for nearly 3 weeks. When I finally uncovered the finished piece, he stood speechless before a walnut bookshelf built from reclaimed timber, salvaged from a 19th century library scheduled for demolition. He ran his hand across the wood. "You made this?" "I did." His eyes met mine. "You remembered." "Remembered what?" "That I once said books deserve homes with history." I laughed. "I remember almost everything you tell me." He wrapped me in a hug. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." That evening, we filled every shelf together, and watching him arrange his history books with quiet excitement brought me more happiness than anything money ever could. A few weeks later, while answering emails after dinner, one sender's name caught my attention. Ethan Parker. The subject line read, "What I finally understand." Daniel noticed my expression. "You don't have to read it." "I think I should." He nodded. "I'll make tea." By the time he returned, I'd already finished the email. "Natalie, I know I have no right to ask for your time, and I'll understand if this is the last thing you ever read from me. Therapy has forced me to confront parts of myself I'd spent years avoiding. For a long time, I told myself I rejected the heirloom your family trusted me with. That wasn't true. The ring was only the excuse. Long before that night, I'd started measuring my own worth through other people's approval. Luxury brands, expensive watches, client opinions, they mattered more than my own judgment. By the time you placed your family's heirloom in my hands, I was so consumed by appearances that I couldn't recognize the most sincere gift anyone had ever offered me. When your grandmother's ring sold at auction, I thought the price was what devastated me. It wasn't. What finally broke me was realizing you'd trusted me with your family's history, and I'd handed it back because I cared more about strangers than I cared about you. I owe Olivia an apology too. I told her a version of our breakup that protected my pride instead of telling the truth. I'm trying to become someone who never makes that mistake again. I don't expect forgiveness or another chance. I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what your family was really offering me. I'm sorry I learned too late. Ethan. I read the email twice before quietly closing my laptop. Daniel set a mug of tea beside me. How do you feel? I thought about it for a moment. I think he meant every word. And? I hope therapy helps him become the man he wanted people to believe he already was. Daniel smiled. And you? I reached across the table for his hand. My life doesn't begin where his regret ends. He squeezed my fingers. No. It began the day you stopped letting someone else decide what you were worth. Months later, after locking the studio one evening, I paused beneath the fading light and looked back through the front windows. Inside were restored tables, old window frames, worn bookshelves, and pieces of history waiting to begin new lives. For years, I'd believed my grandmother's ring represented everything I'd lost. Now I understood it had given me something far more valuable. It hadn't revealed the quality of a gemstone. It had revealed the character of the man I almost married. Daniel slipped his arm around my shoulders as we started the walk home. You look happy. I am. What are you thinking about? I watched the last light fade beyond the rooftops. My grandmother used to say beautiful things aren't valuable because they shine. I smiled. They're valuable because they last. Daniel's fingers found mine as we disappeared into the evening together. Only then did I fully understand that the greatest inheritance my grandmother had ever left me wasn't the sapphire ring itself. It was the wisdom to recognize the difference between someone who admired what glittered and someone who stayed.